It's Just Business with Steve Thomas and your host, Chris Larry.
Hello and welcome to It's Just Business on the Hogsty Network, the show where we look at the dollars and nonsense of the sports media, business, industrial complex, and all its spider webs of connections. Steve, how you doing today?
I'm doing good. Welcome back to the show, man. You've been out a couple days where you had to suffer through Alex. That's not good. That's never good.
It's good to be back. Sorry, summer has its own designs. But yeah, I'm back. Not that rested, but I am back.
Well, yeah, and for those of you who don't know, Chris was over in Tokyo at the Olympics.
Oh, right. Yes, I'm bringing some direct man on the street reporting from Tokyo to It's Just Business here.
He watched Simone Biles get applauded for her mental weakness live firsthand.
Oh, Lordy.
Is that insensitive? I'm sorry.
It's not insensitive. Yeah, I mean, yes, of course it's insensitive, but,
Doesn't she deserve it, though, really? I mean, you put GOAT on the back of your uniform voluntarily, and then you bow out for mental weakness?
I don't know.
Somehow lose respect, a whole lot of respect for that.
If you're hurling your body at such speeds and such twists, and you don't think you have the mental capacity to not break your neck, I can understand that.
I can't at all. She's mentally weak, doesn't deserve the title of greatest of all time anymore, ever. What she should have said is this: I'm afraid I may have an equilibrium problem because I'm having trouble tracking the ground when I'm flipping, and I don't know what's medically wrong with me, so I'm afraid I cannot continue. That's what she should have said. Everybody could have understood a medical problem.
That's just semantics.
It's not semantics. She said, well, I need to take care of myself. Yeah. I have zero respect whatsoever for that. Not 1 ounce. She's weak.
Okay.
Chris doesn't agree at all. That's okay.
No,
you can disagree. It's fine.
I don't agree. But it also is sort of irrelevant what either of us think ultimately.
It's totally irrelevant.
No, and actually I was at the archery all day when I was in Tokyo.
You were at the archery? So I haven't seen a bit of archery.
Yeah, I'm not
Did
even
drama
sure.
happen?
I'm not even actually sure that part of the Olympics is kicked off, to be frank.
I was like, did somebody get shot? Maybe errant arrow somewhere.
Not as of yet. I wish I wish everyone was in Tokyo, but no one is. But we'll get to that in a bit. But first, I don't know. I sometimes think we should just call this the college athletics business show because it just continues to provide topics, stories, and areas of discussion. And the college football world was shaken up this week. And really, if you start to look at it, the entire world of college athletics is shaken up by this. Texas and Oklahoma are joining the SEC, apparently. Right, Steve?
Yeah, so this last Thursday for you guys, the SEC voted unanimously to accept Texas and Oklahoma. Now, what I'm about to say should tell you everything you need to know. Texas and Oklahoma have to pay $80 million in fees to the Big Ten, or Big 12 rather, and are willing to do so happily. Does that $80 million, and I believe that's each, I think. That should, the idea that they're willing to stroke that kind of check ought to tell you everything you need to know. So, look, here's the thing. The SEC is creating a super conference. They've already poached Texas A&M from the Big 12 several years ago. Now they're poaching the other two strongest teams. When I say strongest, I mean by most influence, most money. Texas has been mediocre on the field for a long time, but OU certainly hasn't. So there's not really anybody left of note in the Big 12 particularly. And the SEC is sort of creating a nationwide super conference, really. I heard somebody on the ESPN just this morning say it should be the Southeast Everywhere Conference. Because I mean, I think the long term effect, the long term issue here is if the SEC has every single team, could they just up and leave the NCAA and start their own thing? The Athletic had a good piece about that. Comparing the SEC to how the European Premier Soccer League started.
Well, I think I totally agree. I mean, we not from this angle, although this is a better piece of evidence than some things we've used in the past, but we've been talking about the probability of a super conference or probably or will be the SEC just becoming not just a super conference, but a league in and of itself in some kind of quasi professional, amateur, developmental league, whatever you want to call it, something that is neither its own professional league nor college football as we traditionally know it. So to me, this just is two giant data points in that evolution towards whatever the SEC becomes, being neither college football or the NFL.
Yeah, so really if you pair together the name, image, and likeness stuff that's happened, and now you have the SEC truly building a super conference, where it's us versus everybody else, I think the NCAA is undergoing a seismic shift, and it doesn't apply you alluded to this earlier, Chris, it doesn't just apply to football. It's basketball too, and the two sports that draw basically all of the money into the NCAA is are basketball and men's basketball and football. And so now the SEC has, other than throw out, they don't have Clemson and they don't have USC, but beyond that they've basically got in Ohio State. But beyond that they've got every powerful team in the country. So it really makes me wonder. And again, go to the Athletic article if you want to read about this, but it really sort of makes me wonder if the SEC is creating a super conference that they can't just up and leave and do their own thing with.
I think they definitely are. And even if it's not intentional, the sort of, which I think it is, or I think there's at least somebody in those strategy meetings or strategic vision who have that as an end goal. But even if we assume that that's not their goal, right? Their goal is just bigger, more money, et cetera, totally viable. The unintended consequences of this are certainly going to be like, I don't even know how you argue competitive balance at some degree. Like, they're going to expand the playoffs. So like at some point, is it just the SEC in one super conference and then the rest of college football, and it works much like the AFC and NFC at some point where you just, your playoffs are the top cream of the crop from these basically two half leagues. At some point they're going to have to figure out, how do you actually run competitive balance this way? And, spoiler alert, you can't.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. Because, the Pac-10, or Pac-12, I guess, has almost no influence in college football anymore. I mean, really and truly, USC was the big name and big powerhouse, and the Reggie Bush sanctions destroyed the program, basically, totally, years ago. And for those who don't remember, it's the Reggie Bush controversy was that his parents accepted a house, and it wasn't really anything USC did, but it was Reggie Bush and his family accepting benefits, and the sanctions that the NCAA posed destroyed the program, basically. It was tons of scholarships and everything else. And then you have Oregon, who's intermittently a power school, depending on the year. But beyond that, they have nobody. And now the Big 12 is basically, has basically been destroyed. So really, it's the SEC versus Clemson versus the Big 10 in terms of, schools in football that have influence. And in basketball, you throw in Duke and North Carolina into the mix there. And that's all you got. So, yeah, I mean, it's almost, I think that's a pretty good analogy to say the AFC versus the NFC. One conference being the SEC and everybody else being everybody else. I don't know if the NCAA cares about competitive balance, so really. If they did, they wouldn't let this happen. But if we've learned anything, it's that the NCAA is running the NCAA. The SEC is running the NCAA at this point.
Yeah, and you got to wonder if, at some point, the quote unquote everybody else is going to band together here in some capacity to save, as self-protection. To some degree, they're going to have to band together and think about what it means for everybody else. And you could even make many scenarios where if the SEC just becomes some kind of, I don't know, other quasi-professional, pseudo-developmental league, pseudo-college athletics, and you could make a case now with the NIL, name, image, and likeness stuff, there's a path to money for some of those that might make that value transaction a little bit more favorable to players doing that developmental league model. To everybody else, this actually might be the best thing for everybody else, right? Like, you actually just, does the rest of college football just become, I know they changed the name of this, but what we used to call Division I AA, right? Is it just like this hyper quasi-professional league? And then even your Notre Dames of the world kind of recede into a little bit more like something that we might have seen college athletics in the 60s or 70s.
Sort of like, quote, real college athletics, or the SEC is sort of a pretend professional league. Kind of, yeah. I mean, I don't know. I mean, that's good in some respects, I guess. But I've said this from the beginning, Chris. I mean, I don't want a professional league in college. That's not really college athletics. And the gig's up. I mean, the gig was up a long time ago, I guess. But I don't ultimately think it's good for the country and sports and colleges and everybody to have a professional league of millionaires pretending to play amateur athletics. I mean, at some point, that's not good, I think.
Well, I think you'd have to, I think in this possible scenario, you would stop calling that, whether it's Texas, whether it's Georgia, all these SEC teams. That wouldn't be college sports, right? It would just be, the Big 20 or, whatever they call it, the Big 25 or Big 35. And then it might be, which, ultimately the landscape of college athletics is not that many programs, right? And so does it actually firewall the rest of college athletics to look more like college athletics?
No, I get it. I mean, yes. That makes a lot of sense, and I think that would make many, many, many people happy. That you can sort of return to normalcy a little bit and have the rest of us just sort of surrender and return to what college sports truly is. I mean, there's value in that. It's kind of surrendering to the devil a little bit, I think, but I don't know. It's just tough. It's by the way, if we didn't say it, this is 2025 we're talking about, incidentally, for the OU and Texas thing. And the $80 million looks like that's together for both of them, not separately. But that's still a ton of money to throw into this thing. And also, I think it's very ironic that this conference still calling themselves the Southeast Conference when they've got, Oklahoma, in Austin, Texas, which is not the Southeast Conference. Southeast part of the United
I've seen some reporting, and this is more opinion reporting, so I'm not saying that this is fact, but there are experts prognosticating that they'll never get to 2025. And their big data point for that is that there's I believe it's, who's got the football contracts for SEC? Is that ESPN?
The ESPN. Yeah. There's a whole second part of this I want to
get into. ESPN, that's up in 2023. So if Texas and Oklahoma didn't do this to be left off of that TV negotiation. So to me, it seems very realistic that some maneuvering and continued negotiation means that OU and Texas are in the fold, at least in terms of negotiating and benefiting from that contact, which probably means they're playing in the SEC around the same time.
It's just sort of like if you want an analogy out there, it's kind of like a divorce. You may pretend for a while that you're going to stay in the same house and, all that. But at some point you go, you know what, just go. Let's stop pretending, just leave. And I think you're right. And what's interesting is if you look at the history of major shifts in conferences that always tends to happen around TV renegotiation time, and that's ultimately what it's about. Now, the other part of this, which is very interesting, I think, is the Big 12 has fired off a cease and desist letter to ESPN, accusing ESPN of being in the middle of this Texas no U to SEC thing, because ESPN has the SEC contract. And so the Big 12 is what the Big 12 is accusing ESPN of is encouraging / negotiating / getting in the middle of this to benefit itself to better the SEC TV contract, which it's assuming it's going to get again. And so you have the beginnings of a lawsuit here. You don't write cease and desist letters because you think that anything's going to become of it. You write a cease and desist letter, at this level at least, as a precursor to a lawsuit. So what you may end up having is whatever's left of the remnants of the Big 12 suing ESPN over this while it's happening after Texas and Oklahoma have already left.
And if you want to start just reason why this is happening, which is money, but just to sort of like put some finer points on that. So Steve, you mentioned earlier that it's about the buy-in is about $80 million. That's both, so $40 million each team, basically, or each university. So Texas and OU each reportedly got about $34 million last year by being members of the Big 12. That figure in the SEC will jump to 60. So that means in 2 years they're above their buy-in in this new arrangement for them. So this isn't even a long-term investment. This pays off in year 2.
Oh yeah. I mean, and listen, Texas is in particular is, I believe, the richest athletic program in the country, and if not number one, they're in the top 5, and so they could raise $40 million easily through donors and whatnot. It wouldn't be anything. So, again, I think it's telling that there's that size of a fee, and nobody really even cares about buying it because the potential reward is so much bigger. And listen, Texas is a pretty mediocre program right now in terms of wins on the field. They're going to go to the SEC and get crushed. They're not going to the SEC so they can win a national championship. They're going because if they, the smarter play there would be to stay in the Big 12 and get out of the Big 12 championship, get out of the Big 12 every year and go into the new playoff system and have a shot. Instead, they're going to go to the SEC and lose a bunch of games. And so this isn't about competition on the field. This is solely and only about money, almost to not just to the exclusion of wins, but to the detriment of wins. So if anybody ever thought that college football is about anything but money, this really ought to dissuade you of that notion. Yeah,
that's such a great point. I mean, from a competitive standpoint, you'd never leave a conference where you're even mediocre, probably in the mix yearly, to where you're going to go through the biggest gauntlet, where it's so big and so good they have to start to subdivide the conference itself. Where you just get beat up and bruised to get out of that conference. That's a great point. The flip side of that, not really a flip side, but if you want to look for a legitimate football reason why they make this move, or another motivating factor, is because they also know they're losing the recruiting war heavily. And so who doesn't want to play in the SEC at this point? It is the NFL developmental league. I mean, just go look at what teams had as players drafted this past year. So you can, plus the TV contract, plus the sexy prestige of the league. So the conference, excuse me. Place like, one of the reasons why Texas has been mediocre is because they're losing in-state talent to LSU and the rest of the SEC teams.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you brought that up, because Texas, the state of Texas, is a high school football powerhouse, nationwide powerhouse. And it used to be that UT and Texas A&M grabbed all that talent. All these quarterbacks, all were staying in state between mainly A&M and Texas. And now the vast bulk of those quarterbacks are going to the SEC. LSU's grabbed a bunch of them, at other schools. So yeah, they're losing the battle. Now I don't know if this helps them in the recruiting battle. I mean, I guess you could throw the pitches. You're going to get to play, all the top schools in the country. So stay with us, I guess is what you say. And my response to that might be, well, I can go play for the best teams, not you. But it may help them at some point, at some level, I guess. But they definitely are. A&M or UT in particular is definitely losing the recruiting war, and I think it's embarrassing to the program. They're the school of record for the state of Texas, and they can't keep any of their talent. That's certainly a great point.
Yeah. I mean, I just think they're going to have. I mean, there's lots of kids that would rather stay in state, I think, to a large degree. So they're like, that hook and trigger isn't nearly as powerful anymore. So the only way to preserve it is to make sure that you have the left hand punch of, well, you're in the Premier League too, so you can stay home and you're in the top tier conference.
So let's do a little prediction game here, Chris. Let's fast forward, because I think you're right about 2023. And plus, after they've already announced their intention to leave, does anybody really want to have them hang around?
It does the Big 12 better to just, rip off the Band-Aid and figure out what it wants to be.
Yeah, exactly. So let's assume this happens in 2023. Let's fast forward a couple years. So what is the landscape of college football going to look like? I mean, is something major truly going to happen, and we're going to see the SEC leave the NCAA, or is this just going to be them crushing everybody else? What do you think's what is it going to look like in like 5 years?
I think it doesn't. It's not necessarily an A/B choice, because it could look like all of these things. But I think it's going to be a super. I think here's the possible paths in 5 years. It's either super conference jumps to super league. What does that look like? And they're already going through these changes. And at this point, anyone who says anything about tradition should be slapped in the face. Even I saw a funny Kirk Herbstreit quote where he basically said, "I like tradition, and I understand that tradition is being, steamrolled repeatedly, forward, backward, forward, backward." So no one should even raise that. So all of those arguments are gone. And they're already futzing with the playoff system anyway. I think the other possible scenario is you just build your entire playoff system that gives some kind of collective strength to the everybody else's. And when the everybody else's is the Big Ten and the occasional West Coast powers and Notre Dame, you could figure that out, and you use the playoff system to somehow flatten the sport so that you're at any one time, your 8 to 12 of non-SEC college football programs have a path to compete and somehow deal with the competitive balance problem. So a super playoffs, to me, it's one of those, or a combination of those two paths, is the only thing I really see.
Yeah, so in other words, you have, say, a 12-team playoff where you'd have to have some bye weeks and stuff in there, but have a 12-team give 6 of the slots to the SEC automatically, and then 6 of them to everybody else. And then you have sort of an NFC versus AFC, kind of thing. No, that may be it, because I don't think, as much as I'd love to see the destruction of the NCAA, I just don't know if the world is collectively ready for that. So I tend to think that we're not going to see a huge seismic shift other than just the SEC is going to be running everything. Because they already really are. I mean, the commissioner of the SEC, Greg Stuckey, I believe his name is, he's already running everything, in effect. I mean, Mark Emmert is a emasculated, neutered, pathetic bureaucrat, and the SEC is really running anything already. So, yeah, I tend to think that's sort of what's going to happen. And we talked about the playoff system, I think, while you were out, Chris, maybe. But, I think that's going to undergo major changes, and you may be right. Maybe they just say, okay, SEC, you get this many slots, carte blanche, the top 4 or whatever the number is, and then everybody else gets the rest. That may be one way to deal with it.
Right, like basically the championship game becomes the default SEC champion versus the others champion. Which actually might give you a good football game.
And then Yeah, then maybe your USC or whatever has a good year and they can compete on a individual game level. Yeah,
And
sure.
they've beaten Ohio State and Washington on the way there. They're probably fairly battle tested at that point.
So here's the next question: how long is it going to take before Clemson is in the SEC?
No, what would we say that whenever that new TV contract has to be dealt with?
Yeah, maybe.
The other possible, if you start to feature cast some of this, the other possible scenario I think that this forces, and it's so fascinating because we'll probably, this entire podcast episode and podcast series, we talk about, how men's college basketball and football just are the fiscal engine of anything to do with college athletics and even amateur athletics. But what's super interesting to me is there's still a lot of disparity between college basketball and college football. So even if a room of two, there's a have and a have not. And one of the other things I think you might see here is to decouple universities from conferences per sport. Because what's good for football here is actually horrendous for college basketball. And then you have to have these universities do what's best for them, especially financially, on the train of college football. But the divisions have conferences have a lot more implications, history, importance to the sport itself in basketball. And I think eventually you'll see, this has already happened, so they won't redo it. But imagine if University of Maryland could have gone to who'd they join? They joined the ACC, Big Ten, right? What if I think you'll now see where Maryland football would have gone to the Big Ten and basketball was allowed to stay in the ACC. I think the other possible thing is you'll start to see that be allowed.
Yeah, and there are I could name a couple schools where that at a low level where that already has happened. Like some schools have a Division I football program and everything else is 1AA or that kind of thing. What's interesting is that basketball is not ruled by the SEC. And Duke and North Carolina and Kansas and all these schools, Villanova, none of those schools are SEC. Now they've improved. Alabama's in the tournament and makes waves every year, but it's really just football. So I think that's a good point. And so do you see some of these schools join the SEC just for football and stick it out? For the other sports, yeah, sure, maybe. Maybe what you do is you carve football out as an entirely separate thing. Maybe football leaves the NCAA.
Right, that's a good one.
And football just, entirely. And there's been chatter about this. You just sort of surrender and say, okay, football, we know you're not really an amateur college sport anymore. You're not. So you're out. Do your own thing, and then manage the rest of these sports as true college athletics administered by the NCAA, sort of in the normal conference structure. Maybe that's the future.
Yeah, when you had someone, this is from an article linked conceptually, but not necessarily on this topic, but Notre Dame president, I think his name is John Jenkins, basically recently said that if you want to reform college sports, his way of approaching what he called the football problem was to suggest that the National Football League should start a developmental league, right? So now, and that shifts the blame.
Why would they do that, though?
And I don't think it's practical, and the NFL has been, even tried and somewhat failed if you think about the European League. But the point isn't whether it's going to work or not. My point is that, you have major university presidents starting to figure out ways to make that schism.
Yeah, meaning that he's recognizing that the Notre Dame president recognizing this isn't really amateur sports. That's sort of what he's saying. Now the NFL has zero motivation to do this because they're already having it done for them for zero money, So, and Notre Dame knows this too, of course. So why would the NFL say, okay, we're going to take this over when they're already getting the benefit of it? I mean, it's a practically speaking, that's an impossibility. But I mean, he's not wrong in concept. Let's just surrender. Let's just surrender and just stop pretending. That's my biggest problem is, we're continuing to pretend that college football is just regular amateur sports. And it's very hard to, if you're a fan of a non-privileged college football team, it's very hard to get too invested in it because you know that your team has no chance. Like, I'm not a Boise State grad, but if you go, follow Boise State several years ago, they were a powerhouse, but they got totally shut out. And the reason is they're not in the boys club, so to speak, of the Power 5 conferences. And so you have Utah under Alex Smith, several years ago was like that. And there's been others. But they just have no chance whatsoever. You are out because you're not in the right conference. And it's hard to root for teams like that if you're a grad and have an optimistic viewpoint. So maybe what's best for everybody is the SEC, just take your ball and leave, and then the rest of us will get back to what college football used to be. I think that's sort of what you're saying, right?
I mean, I don't know. Yes, that is what I'm saying. I mean, probably.
And it may be in a poor. I'm saying it poorly.
No, and I think what used to be probably will be the dream, not the reality. But they'll figure out some, fiscal and competitive way to do the rest of the unwashed masses, that aren't in the SEC, and probably through that negotiation, maybe like there's at some point where there's some kind of policy, rule, law, whatever that prohibits the SEC from growing at that point, right? Like if they negotiate that exit and that firewall, then it says, and you stop poaching teams now or whatever.
And the other thing that I'd like to see happen along, when all these changes are happening is the end of the bowl games. Yeah. I just think the bowl games have become so totally and utterly pointless. Nobody watches them. Nobody goes to them. The only tickets are sold are because the bowl games themselves are making the schools buy all these tickets, who then just distribute them to students and donors and stuff. I mean, the ratings are pathetic. They don't mean anything. The bowl games used to mean something when the final rankings came out. Now it doesn't mean anything. So I think, and like you said, like you were quoting Herb Street as saying tradition is dead. The tradition of the bowl games died. Was shot in the head and murdered by a street thug a long time ago.
And I laugh all the time when every quote unquote bowl season, you get all these fans who get their panties in a bunch because good player X decides to opt out of the game. Well, come on, like. Who puts their body, okay, we can all acknowledge that football is an extremely dangerous sport that puts your body in harm's way by choice. Double click on choice, but it does. So why are you going to sacrifice not only your body, but your potential future earning potential off that risk in an exhibition game? I mean, come on. Nobody in their right mind would make that choice.
An exhibition game which no longer has the tradition which made it special in the first place.
Right. Yes. It doesn't even have the facade of why you should care to play.
Yeah. Right. Like even the Rose Bowl. I'd say the Rose Bowl. They used to didn't they call the Rose Bowl the granddaddy of them all? Wasn't that the tagline? Even then, the tradition of the participants, the Pac-12, Big Ten, died a long time ago. Even the Rose Bowl's tradition is totally dead and totally gone. And if you then go down to the Tidy Bowl and the Cat Litter Bowl and the Duracell Battery Bowl or whatever, I mean, none of those, nobody cares at all about any of them. And if I was an NFL prospect, there's no way I would participate in a bowl game.
No, it's insane.
There's no way.
Insane.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's kind of funny. We've talked about a lot of, possible scenarios and the seismic ramifications, and Texas and Oklahoma are big programs. Make no mistake. I wonder though, what is it like in Ohio State? Like what's the last to fall, right? Like, because eventually whatever this, growing monster of the SEC eventually becomes, and it needs to be fed, the next couple programs are obvious, and I wonder, is it like an OSU? Is it a Notre Dame? Like when do we pass the point of no return when it goes after one of these, the last remaining programs?
Yeah, because if you think about the Big Ten, it's Ohio State and everybody else. And even Michigan has been was a historic conference powerhouse, and that's been mediocre for a long time. Like don't forget that during the COVID year, which last year, the Big Ten made an exemption to their own rules to allow Ohio State to play in the championship game, because if they don't, there's no point. Really, the Big Ten has been now as Ohio State and everybody else. Notre Dame is an interesting school. The point is, so if Ohio State ever left, the Big Ten conference would basically sort of be over too. Then you'd have a bunch of mediocre things like the Big 12 has. Notre Dame is a special case, though, because they have their own TV contract. The reason why they're not in a conference for football, because they are in a conference for other sports. The reason was it ACC? They're Big Ten, I guess, right? I can't
or are they
remember.
Big East in basketball?
Maybe it may be so. I don't quote me on, but the other sports for the most part they're playing in a conference. But Notre Dame football makes a truckload of money by themselves, which is why they are by themselves, because they've had the contract with NBC forever. So I don't know if they're going to get Notre Dame to fall. But, the next one's up obviously would be Clemson and Ohio State, obviously. And if they fall, then I think the gig is up, basically. The gig would be up, and the SEC would just be college football.
Yeah, they're in the ACC in basketball, at least.
Okay, there you go.
Yes, totally. And what the thing to track towards that is, how much value that contract is for NBC. Because it's not like Notre Dame plays in. I mean, they're still a good program, but and they've even resurged the last couple of years. But when they stick their head up above, they get whacked. So at what point does NBC? I mean, at what point does that Notre Dame? I understand the history there, and it's like where history's clinging on by its fingernails. But that can't be that lucrative for NBC long term. So at what point does that, when that contract starts to devalue on Notre Dame's side, is when they would feel the pressure.
Yeah, I mean, because you're right, Notre Dame isn't beating up on Alabama. They're playing Navy, and they've got a tradition with USC, which has its own problems, and then they're playing sort of a bunch of Big Ten, teams, and some of the other independents and stuff. And so, I mean, the value of Notre Dame, it really isn't what they do on the field necessarily. The value is in the tradition and the alumni. And yeah, at some point, even maybe 10 years ago, I don't think I would have believed this, but at some point the gig will probably be up, because yes, and we don't have this in front of us, at least I don't, but what are the NBC's ratings with Notre Dame? When they start to crater, because there's no more good teams to play, at some point in the future, yes, Notre Dame could feel the pressure, and it would be a sad day for all the alumni and all that, but what's the theme of this show, which is money? It's all about the money. And at some point, Notre Dame will probably have to cave too, sadly.
Yeah, and at that point, they'd probably even be able to make a fairly reasoned case to their fans and alumni that if we want Notre Dame football to be competitive and be in the conversation and get the funding it needs to compete, it needs to be in the SEC, both for money and football. All right, so let's move on to other giant sports apparent boondoggles here, and look at what is going on in the Olympics. This is a weird Olympics. I'll just say from a personal standpoint, I'm a big Olympics fan, and I have cared very, very little. I have watched some. I'm not saying none, but I was the person that would be watching feeds, watching the late night broadcasts, blah, 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 like really be planning my social, professional, and entertainment life around those 2 weeks. And I barely care. And I have a feeling I'm not alone.
Well, the question would be, no, you're definitely not alone. The question would be why? And yes, I'm a big Olympic fan too. I've always watched the gymnastics. I love the track and field, the swimming. I've always watched all that, and yeah, I think people have cared a lot less this year, and I think it's a combination of things. One is that because the Olympic Committee continues to exhibit its hatred for the United States, the Olympics is once again 12 hours away, time zones away. That's part of it. So like we in the United States hear about all the results in the morning and then watch what we already know is about to happen at night. That's what's happening. I think there's a decided lack of star power, this year compared to other years. Simone Biles and Katie Ledecky were sort of the only two real stars. Simone Biles, we can debate that. We've already debated that. But she's out of it. And Katie Ledecky has lost a race or two. But there's no real big names in track and field. And then, you've got half the country mad at some of these athletes for the social justice messaging. That's turned people off. So I think the destruction of the ratings is a combination of sort of all those things. I'd like to know why you're less interested, Chris, because you don't subscribe to my worldview about the social justice stuff. Why are you less interested?
Well, I think one, it seems like such a forced thing this year that the Japanese people don't want it necessarily. That's caused a lot of problems, COVID related. So there's no, quite frankly, and this is something like watching an NHL or NFL game. I didn't love it, but I wasn't as bothered. Something bothers me about nobody being able to watch this, empty venues, the Olympics. I mean, the Olympics is more than just sports to a large degree, right? It's patriotic pride. It's world coming together. All the hearts, rainbows, and unicorn things are hard to have impact when you're looking at empty stadiums. You're looking at so much tumult about who can go. I mean, it seems like anti the point, right? Like, a vibrant Olympic village and those kind of things and the world comes together are a big part. So if that's completely stripped bare, it loses a lot of its appeal. So that's big to me. I think and this isn't necessarily this particular Olympics fault, but I think my just giant scab of cynicism about sports and commerce in general make things harder to enjoy. So that's probably a piece of it. I am pissed off, quite frankly, about them kicking the sprinter off. I think it's BS, and then so that is a very
well. Tell people what you're talking about in case they don't remember.
Well, Shanae Carey. I apologize. I'm probably getting her name wrong, but probably the best American sprinter, women's American sprinter. I guess got a positive reaction for weed and was kicked off, et cetera, et cetera. And so I just find that, my feelings on that are well documented on the show, but I find it to be just the height of hypocrisy when, I mean, we've talked about this before too, but the other thing that the Russian Olympic fake team, that pisses me off.
It's ridiculous.
So there's it's like, here's the thing. All of these things in past years I have looked past. It seems like such an aggregation of overwhelming hypocrisy, BS, and anti-good vibes that it makes watching the Olympics not the point. It makes it like, this is why I watch.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I disagree with you on the sprinter you're talking about. I mean, good riddance. You knew the rules, you broke them. That's my view. But I think the worst part about it, I'm glad you brought up the Russian whatever it is, because it just makes the Olympic Committee look so hypocritical and weak. Because if everybody recalls, this goes back to the last Olympics when the Russians, was it the Winter Olympics or the summer or both? I can't remember.
I think it was both.
I think, yeah. The Russians were found to have a systematic doping program controlled by the Russian government. So this is not just like a couple people were doping. It was the Russian government was systematically doping up people. And so what the Olympic Committee do? They hypothetically banned Russia from participation, but then they said all your athletes can participate. You just can't call it Russia. So now they're calling it the Russian
Olympic Coalition, is it, or committee?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, I think
ROC.
It was either coalition or confederation or something. It's the Russian team rebranded under a new name. It's just the dumbest thing ever. And look, if you're gonna ban Russia, ban Russia. Don't be weak about it. It makes you look weak. So yeah, that's a big part of it for me. And for me, it's just the lack of American star power. Usually, I mean, I just don't think the ratings. By the way, we preface this by saying The ratings have been atrocious. That's the whole point of our little topic here. The ratings have been awful. The ratings for the Parade of Nations were the worst basically ever for NBC. And because part of it was, like you said, they were marching into an empty stadium and waving at a fake crowd.
It's horrible.
They literally had pieces of paper and seats, which is just, like you said, I think Japan didn't even want this Olympics. They want to just not do it, and they were sort of forced to. So yeah, it was a very fake and fraudulent and phony kind of looking thing. And then I think your average person, other than Katie Ledecky and Simone Biles, your average fan doesn't know who any of these players are or people are. Whereas usually, there's some big name sprinters and stuff, and just none of them are there. So yeah, I think it's a conglomeration of a whole bunch of conditions. And for people on my side of the aisle, the social justice thing is another part of it. And so it's a conglomeration of things, of a lot of things. It's sort of a perfect storm of awful, is what it is.
Yeah. And I think add to that, you sort of touched on it, and we'd say, they're getting their data. I just think NBC just does not know how to cover this anymore either. It's like they have all.
In what way?
What? Well,
I
think that it's too many options for how to watch without actually understanding how people watch. So it's like, it's like a salad bar of stuff no one wants to eat. So, and that's super frustrating. And they stick to this prime time addiction, where they shift everything to those hours, then they gunk up those hours, and then when it starts to go bad, you get more ads in those hours. It's whatever their prime time, their 8 to 11 is borderline unwatchable. And the way they cut,
but they're taking all the stuff that happened throughout the day and throwing it into kind of a scripted
which
program,
is typical. It's not like that's new, but I think they're so straining that form at this point. Just show live sports. Like network TV is dead anyway. If you're taking off programming at noon or whatever, or 10 in the morning, I mean, international soccer has proved this. People will get up. They'll plan their days at 7:30 a.m., at 8 a.m., at 9 a.m., embrace live. You have the channels to even throw that up on, but right now you have no idea where to go. The primetime thing just becomes an advertisement for their streams when they're actually not just giving you advertisements. So you don't actually ever know what you're watching. And they also hide this thing, because you actually can see some live sports in prime time, just given the weirdness of the time differential. So they don't even highlight that in their prime time. Then they're giving you all the replays of the gymnastics or whatever, which they probably would have gotten about the same ratings if they had just showed at 10 a.m., quite frankly.
Probably so. No, that's probably true. And, I think basketball's on Peacock, and nobody knows, how to find it. And even, we pay attention to this stuff, and even I don't know where any of this stuff is being held. I don't know where what all their various channels and streams even are. And so the only thing I've really been doing is I've been watching some of the primetime broadcasts of the swimming and stuff this week, and I haven't been paying a lot of attention to the results ahead of time. The Simone Biles thing was major national news when it happened in the morning, and then you got to watch it happen on tape, at night. So yeah, I think it's the time differential is a major problem. Because again, if we proved anything, it's that the International Olympic Committee hates the United States. They really do. They just refuse to give the U.S. an Olympics. But if it was in the Western Hemisphere, this scripted program thing would be different, because you would schedule the 100-meter final at night and you would have it live. So there's just not really much they can do with it. Yeah, I think they probably ought to just show it live in the middle at 4 in the morning or whatever time it happens. Just show it live. No, I think you're right about that for sure. But they're just not going to do that. It's become sort of this weird caricature of itself, almost, the Olympics. And NBC's coverage too. Like you said, I think they've gotten so used to scripting these 3 hours of this 3-hour block of primetime stuff that they've kind of forgotten the magic of sports is live. I think I'd rather watch live archery than a recorded swimming meet that I already know what happens.
I totally agree. Especially if I could have watched to tape stuff live with their full production value behind it at the time, and they just seem tired, NBC. So it's almost like I don't even know when their contract is up, but you almost like, can someone else take this over? They just seem tired. They just seem exhausted. It's like even when the famous theme comes on, it feels like it's like at 3/4 speed. Everything just feels like a little tired, slow, and lame.
Kind of. Well, they were talking about make goods for advertisers before the Olympics even started. We talked about that on this show when you were out, Chris. And they're talking about more make goods now that the Olympics is tanked. So I think NBC's a bit tired of it, yes. And would it help to kick it over to ABC or Fox or somebody, or CBS or somebody, where they can have kind of a fresh spin on it? Yes, I think so, probably.
I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, but you'd almost wish, or you just open it up, right? Like make it more like NFL, right? Like, like let multiple networks cover it, Imagine if ESPN was the home of, like its original genesis was the home of you could just watch all the sub sports live, like what if different networks just had those contracts to do that well and right?
Yeah, yes, but I don't know the contractual status either, but I don't think it's expiring anytime soon. I think NBC has it locked up for the foreseeable future, as best I can recall. So this is just
this is me wish I want a flying car to get to work faster.
You'll have to go find the Back to the Future guy.
Exactly. So these are whims of fancy. Who knows? Even like NBC pissed me off the other night with the gymnastics stuff. Like everybody knew this. Like whatever all the drama, whatever your take, whatever, everybody's phones was buzzing at 9:45 or whatever local time it was to you, and you think it might be a text.
And that you're going to have the pretend drama at night, even though there is no drama.
They don't even acknowledge that. They stretch it out. So when the Sunil Lee was going to win, they have her at 10:47. Like what the numbers tell you is your optimal time. So it just means that they're just wasting everyone's time from 8 to 11. It's ridiculous.
They're stretching out the primetime program, building up the drama, but everybody already knows what happened, so there is no drama.
And if you ignored it till 8 o'clock, you're probably still spoiled between 8 and 10:30 in some capacity, even by NBC's own reporting and coverage. So it's like insane. Just do 8 to 9:30 and show the whole thing at that point. At least the completist would be like, okay, I know I can watch the competition from 8 to 9:30, and I don't have to get dragged to 11.
Yeah, I mean, listen, like 9 o'clock U.S. time is morning Tokyo time. There's stuff going on in the morning in Tokyo. Just show that.
Plenty of stuff, actually.
Yeah, I agree. Chris is very frustrated today.
I am. The Olympics has got lots of problems. It's got lots of problems. And, to tie it back, an interesting thing that I saw in an athletic article was, to kind of put a bow on it, with a stand-up comedian would call the callback, is that the dirty little secret is that men's college football and basketball, to a large degree, are not just subsidizing these universities' college athletics programs. It's a few steps away, but they're basically subsidizing U.S. and other countries' Olympic teams.
Yeah, so get this. There were 749. This article Chris is talking about. You have the citation right in front of you. 749 Power 5 conference athletes, active current Power 5 conference athletes in the Olympics right now. And if you throw them together, I think they would have already won 55 medals. Like the SEC alone, I believe it was, would have won 55. Has won 55 medals already, but the less than half of those 749 are actually playing for competing for the United States. The majority of those athletes are competing for other countries, and so, but they're stationed in training in the United States. and yet they'll go run, it'll be a sprinter for, Great Britain or somewhere, or Germany or wherever else. So yeah, it's so what Chris is saying is that these are college athletes trained by Power Five conferences who are now in the Olympics competing, and so in effect, college football and basketball is sort of paying for the Olympics in a direct way.
Yeah, this is from The Athletic. It's the title of the article is "We're All Complicit to an Extent: How Team USA Uses College Football and Basketball as Funding Sources." It was published by The Athletic on July 22nd, so still fairly current. And the author was Victoria Jackson. Not the comedian, SNL alum.
Although it is kind of funny.
So yeah, and Steve started to pull some data out of this. It's a super interesting article just about how in depth this goes, and I think using 2016 data, a college sports sustainability think tank, the USOPC, didn't even know those things existed, although I'm certainly not surprised, said that 80% of the 2016 U.S. Olympic team competed for American college teams. And this isn't just subsidizing archery and, the shooting and the other kind of like tertiary Olympic sports. Think about something like swimming, right? Week one highlight where we get the face stars. Michael Phelps is legitimately one of the probably top American athletes, name recognition, yada, yada, the last 30 plus years. So swimming is at the top of the food chain in this type of sport and in the Olympic sports. It's also the perfect example of what we're talking about. So swimming in big college universities is in probably your top third of the sports if they have it. And is how all of these swimmers from all these different countries actually hone their craft and are subsidized to be swimmers. If it wasn't for NCAA college athletic swimming, you wouldn't have an Olympic competition, or it would look and be much different. It would be of much less quality. The athletes would be far less trained. And this just isn't where the athletes go. This is a coaching ecosystem. This is a training ecosystem. This is what actually is the schedule of competitions when they're not doing international competitions. So swimming is the perfect example of a kind of sport that just feeds from the trough of basketball and football funding the NCAA.
Yeah, so the 55 medals thing was from 2016, and so what that was the Power 5 conferences, athletes from the Power 5 conferences in 2016 won 55 medals, which would have placed fifth in the international medal count. And then you have the 745 Olympians that I was talking about is exactly. So 745 Power 5 Olympians, 307 for Team USA, 442 for other countries. And the SEC and the Pac-12 had the greatest number with 53 and 47 represented. So, yeah, it's basically the best college athletes are, with the exception of China and Russia, are basically stocking all of the Olympic teams, more or less. The vast bulk of every other Olympic team. So, yeah, you're basically watching college athletics and throw a bunch of doped up Russians and the Chinese communists, and that's what the Olympics are. Which is a very cynical thing, but it's also the truth.
Yeah, it's definitely the truth. In fact, it has it, so two things. One, we've been sort of, as we were doing with college, what happens to college athletics, he's sort of like, what happens to these, which everyone should admit are just broken systems for athletics. And it would be amazing if we actually looked at solutions, not Band-Aids. But imagine an Olympics hosted by America, not New York, not LA, not Atlanta, where you actually could leverage because America is basically the athletic engine that drives the world. Yes, you could communist China, but even Russian athletes, for large part, benefit from a U.S.-based college and professional system, or participate at a higher degree than they certainly have historically. China might be your only kind of self-contained where the athletes don't touch the U.S. system. Well, imagine like a U.S. Olympics where you had swimming in Florida and you had, track and field in California and things like that. That was actually, leveraging these systems because they're already what's driving it secretly. I'll never forget we were in Grenada for a vacation, which is an amazing spot, by the way. Everyone should go. It's easy to get to. It's incredibly safe. And
were you there in 1983?
I was not, but you do get, they love Americans actually from that. So it's actually...
I don't doubt it. Yeah, we saved their country.
So a special tip, if you want a very easy, very safe, very enjoyable Caribbean vacation, look in Grenada. But they actually had a world-class Olympian, Karani James, who won, I think, medals in over 2 Olympics. The country literally bought him and his parents homes. I mean, the place shut down. I mean, it's really interesting to see what happens when you get the one. But University of Alabama, So like, and I, when we talked about, it was between his Olympics, I think, when we were there, and we talked that all the locals want to talk about Karani James. It's like talking about Michael Jordan. So we got lots of Karani James stories while we were there by cabbies and stuff like that. So, he left Grenada at whatever, 17 and a half, 18, I mean, I'm sure obviously he had lots of talent, no doubt, those are gifts, but he honed those gifts at the University of Alabama, which led to gold and silver medals in multiple Olympics.
Perfect example. So to summarize this, because we're out of time, the Olympics ratings have tanked for a huge variety of reasons. And I think all the things we've talked about, it's the time zone difference, it's the cynicism with some of these athletes, and how the athletes are viewed by some portion of society. It's NBC's coverage of it. It's the fact that we're really just watching the NCAA championships prepackaged, more or less. I think it's all those things kind of put together have meant ratings Armageddon for NBC. Because they're spending a fortune and their ratings are just in the toilet bowl. So that's the Olympics. I don't expect it to change before it's over. It's probably going to get worse before it gets better.
Yeah, and it's also, this is not a surprise to NBC.
No, they were ready for it. We talked about, again, they were given make goods out before the Olympics even started, so they knew this was going to happen.
And I think we've talked about this many ways, and whatever way you want to slice and dice it, and there are many different ways, which is actually kind of part of the problem, people care less about sports. I think that's also what we're seeing, like, across the board. And even with things that are uptick, and we didn't really mention it, but it looks like the NBA playoffs and finals were a little, we're back, not at some of its collapse levels, but are starting to uptick. And we see other things too.
It's amazing what happens when you just play basketball and have a competitive series by people who aren't trying to make cultural points. Just play.
So, but there's lots of reasons why people are, but in general, everyone has their own reason, can say something that isn't what you said, but their own version of that. And I think what we're seeing is just a lessening of people caring, watching sports.
Yeah, I think so. That's true.
So hopefully you don't care so little that we become irrelevant, but we'll see.
We'll find out. Yeah, we'll find out.
All right, Steve, what's going on? Things are probably starting to tick back with training camp opening this past week.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The Hogstye we will be on one show a month, or a week rather, until the regular season starts. Then we will start our regular in-season coverage, which is always a marathon for us to do that week after week. Seasons of Discontent is back. They'll be off this coming week, but they're back and covering all things Washington, D.C. sports and life, and then keep an eye out on our regular written content. All
right. Well, there you go. Hopefully you have some fun games to talk about this year.
Hopefully, yeah. We'll see. I tend to think that the fans may be discounting exactly how tough the schedule is for Washington this year, but we'll find out.
It is a quarterback murderer's row, that is for sure. And I know there's injuries and things always happen, but if you just look at the starting quarterbacks, it's daunting.
Disaster. Yeah.
All right, we will see you in 2 weeks.